All right, here we are with Robinson Jeffers' Original Sin. I'm pleased to welcome again Mr. Jason Schmidt here with me. We're going to work through this poem. We just did Love the Wild Swan, and one thing we will be noting as we move through this poem is some of the structural and thematic similarities between these various poems. A little bit of historicist context here, of course, when you look at the date, 1947. We are just a couple years out of World War II. Jeffers is someone who was very young man when World War I broke out, an older man, slightly older, at the onset of World War II. And I think it's really hard to understand his vision of humanity without having at least some context. Some of his other poems were more explicitly addressed to the contemporary historical situation. And even though this one I think is not directly so, I think it's still tangentially an attempt to understand, how humans have done this to themselves in the early 20th century.
Yeah, I definitely do think that he is a member of this larger group of writers and artists who are psychologically scarred by World War II. I mean, if World War One didn't do enough damage with the mechanizing of war and the loss, World War II, with the use of atomic weapons, is just how do you move forward out of that pit of destruction, right?
Yeah. And even though Jeffers usually isn't associated with that group of writers we call the Lost Generation, like he is a contemporary of them.
Right.
So,
right.
And people like Hemingway went and lived in exile from the U.S. Jeffers lived in his own kind of exile, right? I mean, he went up to Central Coast and basically kind of let the 20th century pass him by rather than allowing himself to be really immersed in it. So one place to start with, of course, is the title, Original Sin. We've talked a lot with Ted Hughes' poetry about cosmogonies, about mythological stories, about origins. And immediately this strikes us as an allusion to the Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden. But as we begin this poem, we'll see that it's very different from any kind of Adam and Eve story.
Right.
So I always kind of look at this as Jeffers offering his own version of the fall of man.
I absolutely agree. I think his definition of what is the actual original sin is much different from the book of Genesis, if you will. And he almost plays into the same tradition as what Milton was trying to do in Paradise Lost, right? In Milton's Paradise Lost, he sees that not necessarily that Adam and Eve, that sense of defiance was an original sin, but he looks at it ironically that the birth of consciousness is an awakening. It's an awakening. It's an enlightenment, and it shouldn't be referred to as an original sin. And it's almost like we're coming back full circle, right? You've got this Miltonian kind of subversive strain of what original sin is, and maybe you're getting Jeffers here in mid-century America challenging that with his definition of original sin.
Yeah, because at some point the origin of the problem is human consciousness or awareness.
Right.
And one thing additionally that's I think a really helpful contrast to understand is just how naturalized this cosmogony is, right? Whereas the book of Genesis is, and there's so many other religious texts, there's gods floating around, gods are breathing life into you, they're creating these lands for you. This, as we'll see when we work through, this is much more naturalized, right? There's really just human in nature, and that's it. So we go through here to start, and immediately we see Jeffers' love for these hyphenated nouns. The man-brained and man-handed ground ape. And I think it's important to look at every one of those. We are the ground ape because we are the one who came down from the trees. We are man-handed because of the opposable thumbs, and we are man-brained because of our intellect, and our ability to use that intellect to satisfy our needs and desires. So, in terms of just the concision and force that this description of early man, like I feel like this is unmatched as like a way to describe early man, right? Um, and and notice the language in a way is also kind of primitive, right? We're not talking about cerebellum. We're not talking about opposable thumbs. We're not talking about Homo sapiens. These are like just very primitive terms to describe what sets us apart from the rest of nature.
And that's what I find somewhat intriguing right now that you're bringing that up is that he begins with original sin, obviously pointing to a biblical allusion, but the first lines have an admission on the theory of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're getting that immediate contrast that, maybe this is a statement about evolution, and maybe this is a statement or even a challenge to evolution. But I like how he begins with this is original sin. It seems mythological, but at the same time, the first line, you're getting a sense that he's buying into this theory of evolution. But it doesn't seem to end very well, does it? It doesn't go in the direction maybe that it should.
Yeah.
Was there a mistake? Right?
Were we the mistake?
Right.
Essentially. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, I like that because immediately what you notice is the contrast between the title and that first line is the contrast from something that feels like it's going to be mythological or religious, but it ends up deeply grounded in the natural, right? Nothing. There's not an abstract noun there, right? We'll have to read on and see where we find an abstract noun, but so far there's no gods, there's no spirits floating around here. So the further description of early man is as physically the most repulsive of all the hot-blooded animals up to that time of the world. And I think that's an interesting way of describing us as the most repulsive physically, right? And I think, honestly, when you see other animals in their element naked, like there's something beautiful about, like, especially mammals, right? Their coats of luxurious fur, and the way they're also clean. One thing you notice about early man is like we don't have the same abilities to keep ourselves clean as other animals do. Like we get nasty. You think about a lion's coat or a gazelle's coat. Like these animals are just gorgeous in the way they move. And to him, like we stand out among those as being this repulsive kind of hot-blooded animal. So. In the same way that with Love the Wild Swan, we kind of felt maybe the speaker's sort of juvenile attitude. This also feels to me not quite juvenile, but certainly hyperbolic, right?
Right.
To call us physically the most repulsive.
But he does then continue about the stench, right? So they stink.
Yeah.
And I think he's even playing off this notion that Adam and Eve felt this necessity to cover themselves as soon as the birth of consciousness, right? There was this need that their own identity was somehow imperfect. I don't think any other species really reaches that level of awareness, right?
No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah. So now after the description of early man, we have activity. They had dug a pitfall and caught a mammoth. But now a problem presents itself, which is that their sticks and stones couldn't reach the life in that hide. So this is clearly like pre-Bronze Age, like before humans had mastered metallurgy. They're basically just sharpening sticks and flints and as a way to try to kill animals. And they're realizing they've trapped this animal in a pit, this mammoth, but they can't kill it. So look at now some of the verbs that attach to them. They're dancing, they're shrieking, still ape excitement, right? They're flinging their sharp flints, and their stench of their bodies is staining the white air of dawn, right? So you see this contrast between their behavior as being this excited, almost kind of frenzied behavior, but it's all behavior in vain. it's not achieving anything yet, and it's, I think we can't understate like that staining there,
Mm-hmm.
right? Especially when we're talking about original sin. When we talked about the Greeks, their concept of sin was different. It was this idea of a miasma or a stain. Um, and so Jeffers is kind of returning and using that idea here too.
Well, I like your focus on the action verbs because then there is this shift, right? It is all in vain, but right, stained the white air of dawn, but presently one of them, and here we get it all alone in this capitalized form, the act of remembering,
Mm-hmm.
right? This
Mm-hmm.
is really, in some sense, this shift or this birth of consciousness where you can think back and use your inductive powers to some degree,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely. Well, it's the first mental activity
Mm-hmm.
verb, right? It's the
Mm-hmm.
first mental activity. Everything else that we've seen so far is physical activity. This is what sets us apart, the remembering, right? This was a thought. Um,
And I almost feel like he should have been a little bit more dramatic
mm,
with that action.
mm-hmm,
It just seems that there is like this shift. There is something that is happening, and it seems associated to his whole redefinition, we might say,
mm-hmm,
of original sin. This recasting, this
yeah,
restaging of this biblical act.
yeah, yeah. Almost, you could almost break the line after
Right,
remembered.
right.
Presently, one of them remembered
Remembered.
and just said it
Right,
there,
right, right, right,
right?
right,
Like
right,
something
right.
different has happened
Mm-hmm.
now,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is a new thing in nature. Um, and what they remembered was fire, yellow dancer, wood eating fire. And now we get back to the action verbs, the running and fetching, the gathering of sticks, the making of a blaze, pushing it into a pit, feeding it high around the mired sides of their huge prey. And they watched the long hairy trunk um, as they roasted this animal to death, and they were happy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, one interesting thing I remember when I first studied this poem, the teacher who brought it out to me mentioned that Jeffers had written this after he had read about an archaeological dig
Mm-hmm.
that showed evidence that there were, in fact, such pits where large
Mm-hmm.
animals had been killed by early man pre Bronze Age. And they had been killed. They were able to, deduce from their archaeological findings that these animals had been killed by being burned alive. They weren't killed by any sort of sharp instrument or blunt trauma. Oh my gosh, and here we have an interruption. This better be good, Dean.
Please excuse this interruption. Please dismiss members of the city council to set up for the rally. Thank you.
Oh, was that really necessary here? Okay, we're back at it.
What's interesting for me, just with his recurrent motif of juxtaposition, is that the happiness is in between the pain and the nobility of the sunrise.
Mm,
So it seems like the whole concept of happiness is ironic here,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like this type of happiness, it seems threatening. It seems violent.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the happiness that we're used to reading.
Yeah, yeah. It's a happiness that depends on the cruelty towards another creature, right? I mean, now we get back to your point about the remembering.
Mm-hmm.
What they remembered was how they could use a human technology to be cruel, right? That was like the original remembering,
right? And this satisfies them,
mm-hmm.
and they were happy. I love the simplicity of that syntax.
Yeah,
right?
No, it's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And notice, like we went from an action verb to now a state of being verb,
Mm-hmm.
right? They've
Mm-hmm.
reached a state of contentment and happiness.
I didn't notice that until now, but that is neat. The efficiency of a linking verb, right, as opposed to the action.
Yeah, when it's what you need, like use it, like when it's what you need. And here, what you just want is their state of being. They've sort of stopped being active, and they can just kind of stand around, watch this thing burn, and be happy. Just be happy. And as you said, the juxtaposition is profound here. The sun is coming up. They've basically been roasting this animal all night. You can imagine, guys, I mean, when you think about what it would take to roast a mammoth to death, I mean, it would take hours, right? I mean, you'd singe fur, you'd singe skin. These animals are a couple tons. This is not an animal that's just going to die from smoke inhalation quickly. This is going to be a long and gruesome process. And so it's taking hours and hours. Notice how I'm going to say another point about the simplicity of the diction that we've seen so long. Notice the colors here, rose and gold and amber. That's different from, say, yellow or red or orange. These are colors of things, right? Rose is a flower, gold is a metal, amber is a sap. So the sunrise is described in terms of the beauty of its colors with reference not to sort of abstract human constructs of color, but to actual like physical things in nature that have those colors. And then we get, an extended description of that beauty of the sunrise, the leaves being stirred. And then we close with this juxtaposition against that natural setting. In its midst, hour after hour, these happy hunters roasted their living meat slowly to death.
And it feels rhythmic. Right? As soon as he makes his transition into the natural landscape, everything just seems to flow.
Yeah.
There's this beauty to just, I'm reading these lines over and over again. As you're pointing it out, the rose and gold and amber flowed up the sky. Wet rocks were shining. There doesn't seem to be, it doesn't seem to feel fragmented.
Yeah.
And it's with this harmony that just once again is associated with Jeffers' concept of nature and how beautiful it is. And it's almost like we get a little sigh of relief, right?
Mm-hmm.
We get a little moment to just enjoy something, but then here's the return.
Yeah, we're going
Right?
to come back to earth.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, these lines just they're as flowing and continuous as a sunrise. Like it just keeps coming up,
Right.
And
Right.
it's just stunning. And what breaks that flow is the happy hunters roasting their living meat.
And then look at the next line, right? The same use of linking verb in the efficiency. And they were happy. These are the people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Disruptors.
Right. Right. Exactly. These are the ones who stand out. And now we get to the real explicit statement that he's offering a new cosmogony. This is the human dawn. It's not the story of Adam and Eve. And notice in the paragraph, or the stanza right before, we were talking about a natural dawn. And now contrasted with that natural dawn, we have the human dawn. And then, much as we saw with Love the Wild Swan, there's the interjection of the self. Notice, nowhere in the prior part of the poem was there any sort of self or identity. Right. It was just a pack of a tribe of early humans and an animal. Now a self emerges. And as you pointed out, like when Jeffers uses that pronoun I, like he's using it for a purpose, and he's often using it with contempt. And I think that comes out here too. And notice the first statement, I would rather be a worm in a wild apple than a son of man. Wow. I mean,
it's one of my favorite lines.
Amazing. I mean, when you think about the self-hatred of, I hate my verses, every line, every word, here it's, I'd rather be the simplest kind of organism living in a wild apple than a son of man. And it's hard not to get the biblical allusions here too, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, certainly with son of man, but also the worm and the wild apple as the serpent in the garden, right? The limbless creature that crawls on its belly.
Well, you almost feel like it's this return or this regression back to our mythological being was somehow better. Right? You get that when you read the poetry of William Wordsworth, and he says, "Oh, great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn." Right? You see this displacement of where these notions of progress and civility are going, and there's almost this nostalgia, this need to return, but which is it's really almost paradoxical here because the return doesn't seem to be a way out either.
Right. Right, and I think that's absolutely right. And immediately, where he admits that the return isn't a way out, we are what we are.
Right.
right? Notice that
Mm-hmm.
return to the linking verbs again there. There's a resignation there, a kind of acceptance. And now we see again, remember. Our ancestors remembered Yellow Dancer. Here's what we might remember: not to hate any person, for all are vicious, not be astonished at any evil, all are deserved, and not fear death. It is the only way to be cleansed.
Yeah, I've always felt really uncomfortable reading those lines.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like them just because of the visceral element of having to wrap my head around like things aren't evil because our very species seems to be inherently sinister. It makes me very uncomfortable to read all of these lines just because I don't want to have these conclusions.
Yeah.
And so he puts me into this corner. Don't be astonished by any evil. How can you not be? All are deserved, and not fear death, right? Because it is the only way to be cleansed. Here's this whole notion of the transhuman, as it seems like here's this postmodern concept of like death being the only route of moving forward. All of it just makes me really uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's the only way out is through death.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and honestly, too, I mean, think of the discomfort you feel now, and imagine these lines in 1947, right? Wait, are you telling me not to be astonished at the Holocaust, right? Not to be astonished at the dropping of atomic weapons? That in some senses all those were deserved? I mean, that... and I think it's meant to be that deeply unsettling, right? Not to hate any person, all are vicious. Really, all of us are equally vicious. Well, in the sense that we're all descended from these same ancestors.
It's our lineage.
We all have, it actually kind of brings me back to the Conrad idea of like, all men have this heart of darkness because all evil is contained within all of us, right? We're all capable. And that's part of what it means to come to terms with your own identity as a member of this species. And if you really think all of us are vicious, then maybe you would rather be a worm and a wild apple than a son of man, right? I mean, if these last injunctions are true, and indeed it's hard to come to terms with your humanity.
And the final section of the poem just feels commanding as well. And then it's a return to all the use of the linking verbs again. Here we are in this more, this stagnant state. I just often think of linking verbs now just associated with like mental activity, whereas your action verbs have there's some representation of that action in the external, whereas linking verbs are internal, right? These are associations that we draw, and they seem that they are almost very deliberately mental verbs, right? And here you are at the end of the poem with the use of this return to the linking verbs, and it is efficient, it feels deliberate, it's commanding.
Yeah, and it gives you this sense of no way out. Like all are vicious, all are deserved, right? Like that's just the state of being.
It is the only way, right?
Yeah. Really, really challenging poem for us to come to terms with as people, as members of this species. A poem that I think kind of demands an answer from us, how do we, if we disagree with it, and if, as you say, like it makes you uncomfortable, like how can we answer it? Or has Jeffers offered, an ironclad argument for his inhumanist perspective?
Right.
Has he basically shown like, hey, this is archaeologically proven, this is evolutionarily where we came from, and if this is where we came from, this is the conclusion you have to draw.
Yeah, this is the result.
Yeah, and so just wait for death, right? Wow, yeah. All right, guys, so that was Original Sin, and we will do this more. Thank you again, Mr. Schmidt, for joining me on
You're
these.
welcome.
This was really a treat.